The hospital called him 4 times. He watched it ring and turned his phone off while his wife was going into labor. 10 minutes later, a 26-year-old nurse, someone who wasn't even supposed to be alone on that floor, made a decision that could have ended 2 lives. Instead, it saved them. This isn't a story about a man who didn't love his wife. It's messier than that. It's about what happens when the person you trust most freezes at the exact moment you need him to move, and what a stranger does in the space he left empty. Her name was Clara Bennett. This is what happened to her on a Tuesday in March. "Something's wrong," Clara whispered. No one answered. That came later. First, the ordinary part. Clara was 34 weeks along when her blood pressure started climbing. Not dangerously, not at first, just enough that her OB, Dr. Patel, wanted her seen twice a week instead of once. She taught 4th grade at Millbrook Elementary, kept working until her ankles swelled. So bad she couldn't get her shoes on before first period. Her husband, Ethan Cole, told her to stop teaching in February. She didn't listen until March. Ethan worked in commercial insurance, the kind of job that ate weekends without ever quite explaining why. He wasn't a bad husband. That's the part people get wrong when they hear this story secondhand. They want a villain, someone cartoonishly careless. Ethan wasn't that. He read every pregnancy book Clara bought. He built the crib himself badly, then paid someone to fix it. By every account that mattered, he was a man trying. But Ethan had a thing he did. Clara called it going quiet. When something got too big, too loud, too much, he didn't yell. He didn't run. He just went still. Disappeared a little, even while standing right in front of you. It had happened at his father's funeral. It had happened once during a fight about money 3 years earlier, when Ethan simply stopped talking for 2 days. Not out of cruelty, just gone somewhere inside himself Clara couldn't follow. She'd noticed it. She hadn't asked him about it. That's a detail that matters later. On the Tuesday in question, Clara's water broke at 6:40 in the evening. 6 weeks early. Dr. Patel wanted her at Riverbend. General within the hour, the hospital with the NICU, not the smaller clinic near their apartment. Ethan was 40 minutes away at a client dinner, in a private room where cell service was patchy at best. Clara called him. No answer. She called again from the car. Her neighbor Priya driving, because Ethan had taken their only car that morning. "He'll call back," Clara said, mostly to convince herself. "He always calls back." He didn't. Not that night. Riverbend General was short 11 nurses that week. A flu outbreak had taken out half the maternity floor's regular staff. The hospital was running, on a patchwork of overtime shifts, and float nurses pulled in from other units. Clara arrived at 7:50 p.m. to a labor and delivery floor stretched past what it could safely hold. The charge nurse, Denise, 22 years on the job, took one look at Clara's chart. 34 weeks. Sudden rupture. Blood pressure trending up again. She got her into a room fast. But fast wasn't the same as staffed. Denise had 6 active patients and 1 other nurse for the entire wing. The obstetrician on call, Dr. Reyes, was already in an emergency C-section 2 rooms down. That left Lucas Grant. Lucas was 26. 2 years out of nursing school, technically still in his hospital's residency-style training track for L&D, meaning he wasn't supposed to be managing a high-risk patient without direct supervision. He'd been pulled from the med-surg floor that morning to cover the gap. He had never run a delivery alone. He'd assisted in maybe a dozen. Clara didn't know any of this. She just knew the young nurse with the kind, tired eyes kept checking on her every 15 minutes instead of every hour. Kept saying, "You're doing so good," in a voice that didn't sound rehearsed. By 9:15, Clara's contractions were 4 minutes apart. Her blood pressure had spiked to 158 over 102. She was scared, not performing scared for a camera, just quietly, sweatingly scared. And she wanted Ethan there so badly it felt like a second kind of pain layered on top of the first. "Can someone try him again?" she asked. Her voice cracked in the middle of the sentence. Denise called. Straight to voicemail. She called the client dinner's restaurant, found the number online, asked the hostess to physically pull him out. The hostess came back 2 minutes later. Said the private room had already emptied out. The dinner had ended around 8:30. Ethan should have been reachable. He wasn't. "He's probably driving," Clara said. "The reception on the highway is bad. He's probably—" She stopped talking because a contraction hit in there. Wasn't room in her body for the sentence. And the pain at the same time. Priya sat with her, holding her hand, not saying much, because there wasn't much honest to say. At 9:40, Lucas came back in to check the monitor, and his face did something. Clara would replay in her memory for months afterward. A very small, very fast flicker of alarm. Gone almost as soon as it appeared, but not fast enough. "What?" Clara said. Not a question, a demand. "The baby's heart rate dropped," Lucas said. "It came back up, but I want to reposition you and keep a close eye." He didn't panic in front of her. That was the thing people would later say about him. He never let his face tell her more than she needed to know in that second. But inside, Lucas was doing math that scared him. Late decelerations repeating, a first-time mother with rising blood pressure, a doctor tied up in another OR, a charge nurse juggling 5 other rooms, and him, 2 years in, no attending physically in the room, making calls he wasn't credentialed to make alone. He paged Dr. Reyes. No response. She was elbow-deep in the other C-section, unreachable for at least another 20 minutes. He called down to the OR desk. Same answer, not available. For a moment, Lucas stood in the hallway outside Clara's room. Later, he'd admit quietly to one person, months afterward, and that he thought about waiting. Waiting felt like the safe choice, the covered choice, the choice that wouldn't get him fired. Protocol said escalate and wait for a physician. Protocol didn't account for what happens when there's no physician to escalate to. Then he heard the monitor's tone change again, longer this time. He stopped thinking about protocol. Here's what almost nobody in that hospital room knew that night, including Clara herself for another 2 days. Ethan hadn't ignored her calls. He'd seen every one of them. At 8:52 p.m., 12 minutes after his dinner ended, Ethan was sitting in his car in a parking garage 3 blocks from the restaurant. Engine off, phone in his lap, watching Clara's name light up the screen for the 3rd time. He didn't answer it. He watched it ring out. Then, with a kind of deliberate, terrible calm, he turned the phone off completely, not because he didn't care, because 40 minutes earlier, while he was still at the table with clients he couldn't excuse himself from without real damage to his job. His sister had texted him one line, "Mom had a stroke. We're at St. Vincent's, come now." Ethan's mother had raised him alone after his father died young. 11 years before this night, Ethan had gotten a call almost exactly like it, his father collapsing at a job site. He'd been an hour away, hadn't made it in time to say goodbye. He had never told Clara how much that absence had hollowed him out. By the time they met, he'd built a whole personality around not being that person again. Reliable Ethan, present Ethan, the man who built the crib himself. So when the second impossible call came in, his mother now, his wife 40 minutes later, something in him didn't break loud. It broke silent. He sat in that parking garage unable to make a decision that felt survivable in either direction. If he went to Clara and his mother died without him there, it would confirm the worst thing he believed about himself. If he went to his mother, he was doing the one thing he had promised himself, promised Clara. He would never do again, vanish when she needed him most. He turned the phone off not to escape Clara. He turned it off because he could not bear to hear his own voice choose, out loud, between the 2 people he loved most in the world. It was the same freeze Clara had seen at his father's funeral. The same one from the fight about money, except this time the stakes weren't a bad night. They were 2 hospital rooms. 40 minutes apart, both counting down. He drove to St. Vincent's, sat with his mother, who was stable but frightened for 6 hours. Phone still off, telling himself he'd turn it back on in a minute that kept not arriving, because turning it on meant facing what he'd chosen and what it might have cost. This isn't an excuse. Clara would say that herself later more than once. It's the truth. And the truth doesn't erase what it did to her. Lying in that bed believing she'd been left entirely alone. But it changes what kind of story this is. It isn't a story about a careless man. It's a story about a man whose oldest wound reached up on the worst possible night and made the decision for him. Back at Riverbend at 9:58 p.m., Lucas Grant made the call that would define the next several months of his career. The deceleration on the monitor wasn't recovering. Clara's blood pressure had climbed to 164 over 106. Lucas did a quick exam and found something he'd only ever seen once in training. on a simulation dummy. A loop of umbilical cord had slipped down ahead of the baby, being compressed with every contraction. A cord prolapse, one of the true 5-alarm emergencies in obstetrics, the kind where minutes decide outcomes. He knew exactly 2 things. First, that this baby needed to be delivered by emergency, C-section in minutes, not the 20+ it would take to free up Dr. Reyes. Second, that the single most important thing he could do, right now with his own hands, was relieve the pressure on that cord by manually elevating the baby's head off it, a maneuver he was trained to assist with. Never to initiate. "I need you to trust me," he said to Clara. His voice, for the first time all night, wasn't calm. It was fast and urgent, and somehow that honesty steadied her more than composure would have. "I'm calling a full team right now. I need you to breathe with me and not push." He hit the emergency call button and shouted into the hallway for Denise. Then, without waiting for a doctor who wasn't coming in time, Lucas positioned his gloved hand and did the maneuver himself. Off protocol, past his scope. The kind of decision that gets written up regardless of outcome, because hospitals are built to protect against liability first and heroism second. Denise burst in 90 seconds later with 2 more staff and a crash cart. Dr. Reyes, alerted by an overhead page, tore out of her first. Surgery the second the closing. Sutures allowed a resident to finish. She reached Clara's room at 10:04 p.m. 6 minutes after Lucas made his call, already scrubbing as she moved. Cord prolapse, D-cells not recovering. "I've had manual elevation going for 4 minutes, Lucas said. Dr. Reyes didn't ask why a second-year nurse was doing a maneuver, reserved for physicians. She looked at the monitor, looked at him, and said, "Good, keep exactly that pressure. We're moving now." They ran Clara's bed down the hall at 10:06. In the OR, Dr. Reyes delivered the baby, a boy, 4 pounds, 2 ounces, at 10:19 p.m. He didn't cry immediately. For 11 seconds that Clara would later describe as the longest of her life. The room was silent except for a NICU team working over a tiny, still body. Then he cried, thin and furious and alive. They named him Miles. Ethan turned his phone on at 4:15 the next morning, sitting in a hospital cafeteria 3 miles away. 11 missed calls, 1 voicemail. Denise's voice, careful and clinical. "Mr. Cole, your wife delivered at 10:19 p.m. Both she and the baby are stable. Please call the unit when you're able." He didn't call. He drove. He walked into Clara's room at 5:40 a.m., still in yesterday's shirt, and found her awake, holding Miles against her chest in the too bright fluorescent quiet of a room that had almost held only grief. She didn't yell. People who weren't there sometimes assume she did, because it would make a cleaner story. What she actually did was look at him for a long moment, taking in his face and say very evenly, "Where were you?" He told her. All of it. His mother, St. Vincent's, the parking garage, the phone going dark in his own hand while he sat frozen between 2 people he loved. He cried telling it, which he almost never did. Clara listened without softening her face, because she was still holding the memory of 11 seconds of silence in a delivery room that he hadn't been in. "I believe you," she said finally. "I believe every word. That doesn't mean I'm okay." He asked what she needed. "I need you to stop going quiet when things get hard," she said. "Not eventually, now. I need you in a room with someone whose job it is to help you figure out why you disappear. Because I can't be the reason you finally stay, and I can't keep raising a kid wondering if the next hard night is the one you go missing for." Therapy first. Real, weekly, not when it's convenient therapy. Then we talk about what comes after. It wasn't a punishment. Clara was careful, even in that moment, not to make it one. She'd thought about the shape of this conversation for hours. Alone, with a newborn, on her chest and a nurse's kindness still ringing in her ears, louder than her husband's absence. She wasn't offering an ultimatum designed to fail. She was offering a door with a condition attached because she'd learned, at 28 weeks pregnant with a marriage and a son on the line, that forgiveness without change was just a slower kind of leaving. Ethan started therapy 9 days later. Not because Clara made him, she couldn't have. Not really. But because he sat in the hospital parking garage one more time, in daylight this time, and finally let himself feel what almost happened instead of freezing in front of it. As for Lucas Grant, the hospital's review board spent 6 weeks deciding what to do with a nurse who'd broken protocol and, by every clinical measure, saved a baby's life doing it. In the end, they didn't fire him. They didn't quite officially commend him either. The paperwork trail was too complicated for a clean hero narrative. What they did was quietly fast-track his certification into full L&D practice, 6 months ahead of schedule. Denise, the charge nurse who'd trained him, told him something he still repeats to newer nurses on hard nights. "You didn't break the rules. You just found out where they end." Clara sent him a card 3 weeks after Miles came home. She didn't write much. Just, "You were the one who showed up. I won't forget that." 6 months later, Clara and Ethan were still together. Not healed, not finished, but trying, in the specific, unglamorous way that actually works. Tuesday appointments, hard conversations at the kitchen table, a marriage being rebuilt one honest sentence at a time instead of one grand gesture. Whether they make it all the way back to each other, nobody watching this story gets to know yet. Not even Clara, if you asked her. What she'll tell you is this: the man who left wasn't a villain, and the nurse who stayed wasn't a saint. They were just two people who did what they did on one impossible night, and everyone left standing afterward had to decide, slowly, what to build from it. She believed him. She just didn't forgive him. Not yet.